morning, everyone. This is Tom Moore from BikeFans.com, and we're pleased to host a bit of a homecoming today, as our guest was the senior editor for ESPN 1500 in the Twin Cities and covered the Vikings from 2011 to 2013. He currently provides national coverage on the NFL for USA Today. I want to welcome Tom Pelissero back to his Minnesota fans. Tom, how are you this morning?
Not too bad. How about yourself, Tom?
I'm doing great, but I understand your family grew a little bit a few weeks ago, and I was wondering if you could tell us about your new daughter, Tegan Pelissero, and how was her first July 4th weekend?
It was pretty quiet. Fireworks were not really going to be, at least visually, in the mix for her. We kind of sat up on the back porch and listened to them. They freaked her out a bit. We went inside. It was highly exciting, but I'm catching up on sleep as best I can, whenever I can here, and we're trugging along. She's been good so far.
Well, before you came to the Twin Cities, you covered the Packers for the Green Bay Gazette. And so, Tom, can you tell us what the big difference is between Minnesota and Green Bay football fans?
It's a tough question. I think that there's probably a lot of stereotypes that are based upon the outliers to a degree. But I can say this. It's different living and covering football in Green Bay than it is in Minnesota. Because in Green Bay, and I don't think the people there would dispute this, that's what they have. It's the Packers. I mean, there's not a ton of entertainment options. There's not another professional sports franchise. You get the Bucks and the Brewers down in Milwaukee. But within Green Bay, and the way that community rallies around that team, the way that really Green Bay comes alive for the 10 days a year plus playoffs that the Packers are at home, it's remarkable to see how the entire town transforms and how you have, this little square cut out of Ashwaubenon, Wisconsin, where, Lambeau Field houses 70,000 plus people on Sundays. It's a different sort of an environment. The story I always bring up to sort of describe the intensity of fans' attention on the team was one time I was out eating lunch during training camp. This would have been probably 2007, 2008, somewhere in there. And I heard, these four blue-haired old ladies at the booth behind me talking about the Packers. And, I couldn't quite tell what was going on. And all of a sudden it occurred to me what they were debating was whether or not Jarrett Bush should be the nickel cornerback. You're not going to find that conversation in your average restaurant in Minnesota, particularly, among a bunch of 80-year-old women. But that's exactly what they were talking about, whether or not Jarrett would be able to cover receivers in the slot. It's a different, not to say the Vikings fans aren't in tune, but I would think that there's probably other topics of discussion. In Green Bay, it really is the Packers 365 days a year.
Well, probably nobody's ever asked you about the timing of this story, but you were pretty much in Green Bay through 2009, and it's about the time Brett Favre came to Minnesota. Is it a fact that he came to Minnesota because he knew you were headed to the Twin Cities?
I don't think so. He beat me there by a year, but I did cover his exit and divorce from the Packers, which was easily up there for most bizarre things. I covered that 2010 Viking season where the roof collapsed and they got snowed in Philadelphia, and Randy Moss came back and Childress got fired. I mean, that was a crazy season. But in terms of, 72 hours or so, when Brett Favre was debating coming back, when he showed up at Lambeau Field, when you had the fans jeering Aaron Rodgers during practice and chanting for Favre, Favre's up meeting with McCarthy and Ted Thompson alternately inside Lambeau Field. I remember standing on the loading dock on that day from, 6 a.m. straight through to whenever Favre left the building that day, waiting for him. I got more sunburn than I've probably ever been in my life. Standing there with the August sun beating down. But you had a couple hundred people sitting there staring into the loading dock, waiting to see exactly what was going to take place. And he ends up getting traded to the New York Jets of all places. To take that sort of circuitous route and end up in Minnesota where he always wanted to be, it's one of the more remarkable stories. It's just unfortunate that he throws that interception in the Superdome. The Vikings fell short of the Super Bowl, and then he makes the decision to come back for that 2010 season, which was just a disaster on every level.
Yeah. Well, I imagine it's not always easy being a sports reporter because, like the incident you had with Jerome Stinson in 2012, reporting the news can sometimes hit a sore spot with the players. Tom, how do you balance needing to report the news but maintaining the relationships with players and coaches for the future insight you need to do your job?
That's the most difficult thing, I think, of being a beat reporter in anything. Whether you're covering professional sports, you're covering the cops beat, city government, whatever it is the very same people that you're relying on for information and relying on to talk to you are the same people that sometimes you have to criticize, or sometimes there's occasions where you have to expose him. With Jerome, I still don't entirely know, and I've never had a long conversation with him about exactly what it was that set him off. Obviously, I did those in-depth film reviews each week, and Jerome wasn't playing well, during the course of that 2012 season. Now, he had a back injury that he had suffered early on in the season where, if you remember, and I'm trying to remember the exact details of the story, but it was something along the lines of he went to bed the night before a game, woke up, one of his legs was numb. He talked him into making him active, but went out, couldn't really run, couldn't really play. And then thereafter, he was, I think, inactive the next week. And then Jerome started just denying that he was hurt. And it was so obvious in watching him run, because Jerome's a fantastic athlete. I mean, he's a good football player. He wasn't himself. And why he was denying that he was hurt is just something that I've always found to be a bit of a head-scratcher. It's not as if Jerome Simpson became a bad football player overnight. The guy wasn't 100%. He took exception somewhere along the line to me pointing out that, or pointing out the fact that, frankly, he wasn't productive. He wasn't playing well. He wasn't exactly making the most of his snaps. Got mad at me, said something to me. I tweeted that he sent it to me because it had happened the previous weekend. I think he had said it in a TV interview or something like that. Then said it to my face. In hindsight, my only regret there is I probably shouldn't have even tweeted that he said it. It's fully within my rights. He did it in front of 100 people, which is why I did it, which is why I put it out there. It probably wasn't necessary, and that's probably something that, in the future I would go back on. But at the same time, Jerome, like every other athlete, is bound to the fact that you have to be, if not respectful, you at least have to be mindful about how your actions and things you say are going to reflect upon you. And there's dozens of examples of that around the NFL every year.
Well, you talk about how perceptions reflect upon the person, and I'm curious what you're hearing about the investigation and the charges that Mike Priefer used gay slurs to create a hostile work environment for Chris Kluwe and other players. And from your perspective, if Priefer is found guilty of the charges, how much of a distraction will it be going into training camp?
Well, from everything that I understand, I'd be surprised at this point if they came down hard and determined that Mike Priefer meant the put all the gays on an island and nuke it, or whatever that quote was, that he meant that literally and that he said it and that he is a blatant homophobe. I would be surprised on that. If, in fact, the report says that, then I think that the Vikings would have to take strong action. Are they going to fire him? I tend to think not, unless there's other allegations that come up within the report that are not out there already. But you'd certainly think that a suspension would be in order, that docking his pay would be in order, that they would take the strongest steps that they can in order to show that they are being conscious of this. Because the Wilfs are not, certainly not homophobes. They're people who I think have shown support for the gay community through the years. I think that they, at a time where they're building a $1 billion stadium, that's funded largely by taxpayer money, I don't think that they want to be the owners that support somebody who's going to use that kind of language. It's a tough deal, though, because I've been in locker rooms long enough over the past 10, 11 years to tell you, that those words are said a lot. There's a lot of stuff that you hear in a locker room, just like you hear in a college dorm or in a frat house, you would not accept anywhere else. Look at those text messages between Richie Incognito and Jonathan Martin. If you take any one of those text messages, or you take the voicemail and you take it out of context, you're going to say, wow, what a horrible thing to say. But the volume of the text messages back and forth, the thousands of them, sort of show the pattern here. And it's not unlike things that you would hear if you walked into a locker room tomorrow. Again, it's a matter of perception becomes a big part of this. And that's not to say that in any context, offensive language or hate speech is offensive. I mean, I'd be the first person to say that, my grounds for living my own life and, politically are just don't do things that harm other people. Don't do things that are going to diminish other people's lives. But you have to be, if you're going to do it, you have to be smart enough to keep it out of the public eye. You can't be, somebody who's going to say it publicly. If you're going to tweet something, I mean, how many players get in trouble every single year for tweeting something? Look after Michael Sam got drafted, and a couple of players tweeted stuff about, it's sickening. You just have to be, you can't be that dumb. If you say it to your boys, I don't condone it, but that's going to happen. I mean, that's going to happen in, whatever, apartments across the country. But don't be dumb enough to put it out on social media. This is the age we live in here, where Johnny Manziel goes to Las Vegas and he has 15 different websites all reporting exactly what clubs he was in. I mean, it's a crazy time.
Yeah. Well, we talk about Kluge and the whole process, and we've always heard that he kind of marches to the beat of his own drummer. When you were covering the Vikings, what was he like? Was he a loose cannon, and did he fit in with the other players in the roster?
I don't know that he necessarily wanted to fit in. I mean, Chris was his own man. He was a different guy. I think that he was somebody people in the locker room liked, and they respected his opinions. I didn't think that he was, a loose cannon per se. I think that implies that he was unable to control the things he was saying. I think everything Chris does is fairly calculated. I disagree with some things. I disagreed, and I told him this. When I talked to him after he wrote that story for Deadspin about Priefer, I didn't think that it was appropriate or served his purpose to say that his goal in that entire situation was for Mike Priefer to never coach football again, because that took it from Chris standing up for gay people and Chris standing up for what is right to seemingly being vindictive and wanting to ruin somebody else's life. And Chris' comeback was, well, whose life is ruined? My career's over. I said, yeah, your career's over, but you're a guy who writes books. You're gonna have plenty of career opportunities. With Mike Priefer, he's a guy who, may have gotten a head coaching job, if not for these allegations coming out, or certainly at least would have been considered for the job. I think the Vikings would have seriously considered him. I don't think he would have gotten the job, but I think they would have looked at it based on the number of players who stood up for Mike Priefer. And again, this is not to condone if Mike Priefer said those things. My personal opinion, and based on what I've heard, is that this is not something where, if he said those things, that he meant them 100% literally. And I don't think that anybody would be dumb enough to say that in that particular context, to say, I'm going to, put all the gays on an island and nuke it until it floats. And Mike Priefer is a smarter guy than to say that. And I don't think that his character, is reflected upon that. But in terms of Chris, Chris is also going to make a big deal. I mean, that's the guy that you're dealing with here. He's somebody who is absolutely not going to be afraid of anybody. If he feels as if a wrong has been committed, he's going to push it all the way, and that's where you see this entire thing being played out to the degree it has.
You mentioned that you talked to him and kind of gave him the advice of what you might have done differently. Does he take that advice, or does he have a hard time hearing another point of view?
Well, I wouldn't say I gave him advice, and nor would Chris listen to my advice any more than he would listen to Mike Priefer's advice to stop standing up and putting stickers on his jersey and speaking out about social issues that he gave him a couple of years back. And Chris he's absolutely his own man. And what I always have respected about Chris is that we can have a constructive conversation, and I can be critical of something that he said, and we can talk it out, and he's not going to, get offended and hang up with me. I mean, we talked for about 45 minutes that night, and I think that Chris is a fascinating individual, and while he's not going to fund the NFL again, I certainly think he's got every career opportunity out there that he could possibly want.
Yeah. Well, Tom, you've gone on record as saying that Leslie Frazier was one of the classiest people you ever met, but as a head coach, why would you say Mike Zimmer was the better choice for the Vikings at this time?
Well, I think that you had long-running drama that's taking place at Winter Park. I think that, and this is not to say that Leslie Frazier could not have had success. I mean, they were a playoff team in 2012, but there was just this constant nonsense that went on behind the scenes. And it's really something that, for anybody who's followed the Vikings for the past, 20, 30 years, there's always been something. I mean, they've always been among the league leaders in sort of weird stuff happening off the field. They haven't necessarily had, a massive scandal surrounding them, but even things, look at the 2010 season. You can make a top 10 list and leave some amazingly crazy things off that list. Now, that happened under Brad Childress's watch, but with Frazier, you have this roller coaster where they were a remarkably streaky team. There was certainly some pushback from veteran players against the coaching staff at times. You had just little things happen last year. Players, it'd be a padded practice day, and you'd have some of the veterans show up in shells because they didn't want to practice in pads. It's things like that just sort of sit the wrong way. The Josh Freeman situation, where they bring him in to be the quarterback. He performs poorly in practice, and then Leslie stands up and, says, this guy's going to lead us. He's going to be the starter on Monday. And players look around at each other going, is this a joke? We're not really going to put that guy out on the field. There seem to be a lot of agendas, and I think that, and this is not necessarily a criticism of anyone in particular, but when you have Rick Spielman promoted to general manager a year after they hire Leslie Frazier as the head coach, no matter who is involved, and I think that Leslie is one of the nicest people in the NFL, I think that Rick Spielman, is somebody that I have a lot of respect for and is a really smart guy and gets along with people. But when you have any general manager who inherits a head coach, inevitably there's always going to be something in the back of his head saying, I need my own guy. And I don't think that Leslie Frazier would have been Rick Spielman's choice. back in 2010. That was the decision the Wilks made after that season was over. They go 3-13 in 2011. They promote Spielman to general manager, but they also say Leslie Frazier is going to be the head coach, at least for now. The Vikings happened to win a lot of games in 2012, then tanked out again in 13. What Spielman got in Mike Zimmer, I think, is somebody who sees the same vision he does. And they brought in a veteran coaching staff. They brought in people who immediately, the minute they walk in the door, based on their track record, command some respect. I mean, guys like Mike Zimmer, guys like North Turner. These are not people who you have to explain your credentials to them. Bill Musgrave had been an offensive coordinator at Carolina for about 5 minutes and had guided two offenses in Jacksonville that ranked at 24th and 25th or something like that in the NFL a total offense. You had Alan Williams, who had not been an NFL defensive coordinator. Priefer had been around. You had Fred Puckett, who was the previous defensive coordinator, who had not done that at the NFL level. You had a lot of guys who were sort of trying to talk players into getting behind. And in a lot of cases, when things went south, guys weren't behind their coaching staff to the degree that they needed to. That's where, when I talk and write about the fact that the volume is raised at practice, that's anecdotal and doesn't necessarily mean anything, but I can tell you this. I mean, you listen to the coaches right now, the way that they get on guys, it is remarkable the difference from what it's been under past regimes. I think they do it in a respectful way, and guys respect them back because, this is North Turner, the guy who was putting together the offenses for the Cowboys in the 90s when they were winning Super Bowls.
Yeah, you mentioned the Josh Freeman incident, and obviously you were close enough to see it, and you probably saw him in practice. He had shown flashes in Tampa. What went so terribly wrong with that experiment with him, and did Rick Spielman really believe Freeman was the answer at quarterback when he brought him in?
I don't know that it's a matter of whether it's the answer at quarterback. I mean, they signed him for $2 million for the rest of the season. They brought him in because he had a lot of talent, because he had shown in Tampa Bay. It wasn't just flashes. I mean, I think it was the 2010 season where he had a fantastic touchdown-to-interception ratio, appeared to be an ascending player, and then there was a coordinator change in Tampa Bay. There were a couple of coaching changes, just things like that took place that maybe play into a guy not being, as locked in on exactly what he needs to do to get to the next level as he needed to be. But there were a lot of things going on surrounding Josh Freeman, and they pulled him from a really strange situation. I talked to his personal quarterback coach after his struggles against the Giants, and in that guy's opinion, he would have said Josh Freeman sit out the rest of the season because there were not just issues of he didn't get along with Greg Schiano. There were issues with his fundamentals, just little things, his footwork, the way that he would release the football. He was struggling, obviously, to pick up the Vikings offense in such a short a time frame, and there was all this pressure to put him on the field. And Leslie Frazier, who made that decision to play Freeman, I think did that within the context of, well, if the general manager is bringing this guy in and we're struggling, I got to find a way to spark this team and try to keep my job. There's a lot of different things that went into him being on the football field, but I think the one thing that you would find across the board, if you asked around that building, was the biggest mistake they made was putting Freeman on the field when they did.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the quarterback position, people in Minnesota are really excited about Teddy Bridgewater, and the early reports from minicamps and OTAs are favorable. But from a realist standpoint, does Bridgewater have what it takes to be a franchise quarterback, or is he merely better than what the Vikings have had to work with in quite some time?
I think Teddy Bridgewater has, good makeup. He certainly has a sound physical skill set. Is he going to measure and is he going to look exactly like you would like your franchise quarterback to look? Maybe not. He's not a huge guy. He's sort of slender-shouldered. He has small hands. He throws with a glove on, which I think everybody is going to realize pretty quickly doesn't matter at all. But you look at how efficient he was, starting from day one at Louisville. You look at his touchdown-interception ratio last season. You look at the way that he performed, in some of the big stages. Now, did he have consistently fantastic performances against top-tier opponents? You don't really get that necessarily in that conference. But I think that Bridgewater played well at some fairly big times, even in the game they lost to Central Florida, where Blake Bortles ends up beating them last year. Bridgewater played fairly well in that game. Rick Spielman was at that game. What I was told really sold them was after that disastrous pro day workout, the Vikings brass went down, worked with Bridgewater at another private workout. And it was not just the way he threw the football on the field, but they put him on the board. They went through film with him. They spent 4 or 5 hours in the classroom with Bridgewater and also had dinner with him, really got to know him. They came away thinking this guy's going to be able to improve. And the things that we saw on tape are what matters here, not what happened at the pro day. I think that Bridgewater can be a really good NFL quarterback, but there's so many different things that go into this. There's so many filters that guys have to pass through in order to get to that next level. And I think that that's where the Vikings are going to be really cautious with when they put him on the field. Because it's not just, well, you've got a bunch of offensive weapons. You know, you got Adrian Peterson and Cordero Patterson and Kyle Rudolph and Greg Jennings. You got these guys around, and Bridgewater will be fine. Well, it's not just that. I think the offensive line's pretty good, too. But what if the defense isn't any good? What if the defense is hemorrhaging early game touchdowns, and they're down in 14-0 holes, and Teddy Bridgewater is forced to throw the ball 55 times, and the defense knows they're going to throw, so they pin their ears back and blitz the guy and kill the kid. I mean, that's what you can't have happen here. I think they'll leave Matt Castle out there to, take his lumps. I think that he'll go out, and I think that he's somebody who you can play with. Are you going to win big with Matt Castle? I don't think so, but you can certainly play with him. You can continue to develop the rest of your team. I think Castle's the starter in week 1, unless Bridgewater absolutely blows away everybody in training camp.
And you mentioned the offensive line being good, but one guy who struggled last year was Matt Kalil. And do you see his 2013 performance as a fluke, or is he really the right answer for the next 10 years at the tackle, and it just was an out-of-the-ordinary season?
Well, I think that Matt has some growing to do. He's got to learn how to be a professional. He's got to learn how to take care of his body. He's got to learn how to put in the film study and put in the time to continue to be a better football player. He's so physically talented. He's so naturally talented that I think for a lot of his career, he could get away with not necessarily working his absolute hardest and still be a really good football player. I think that what Twill probably learned above all else last year is the fact that you're not just going to win with your physical ability week in and week out. He was a really good player as a rookie. He was a Pro Bowl caliber player. His second year, he was not. He needs to get better from that. He certainly was nicked up last year. He's coming off the knee surgery, missing a lot of the off season. That is going to be a really important position. I know there's some GMs and personnel people out there in the league who will refuse to take quarterbacks if they don't have the left tackle position in place because they just think it's that important to keep that guy upright. Look at the Miami Dolphins passing on Matt Ryan to take Jake Long. It was the same theory. You didn't want to take the quarterback until you had the left tackle. If Khalil can be the left tackle that the Vikings think that he can be, that's a really good offensive line. I mean, John Sullivan remains a really good center. I think Phil Loadholt gets a bad rap from Vikings fans, but he's a really good, solid right tackle. And Brandon Fusco quietly has developed into one of the better guards in the league. They got a good group there. If David Yankee eventually could take the reins from Charlie Johnson, the left guard, that could be a top 10, maybe even top 5 sort of an offensive line in the NFL, which is good news for Teddy Bridgewater in the long term.
Yeah. Well, when we switch over to the defensive side of the ball, during the minicamp so far, we keep hearing a lot of talk about Chad Greenway in the middle, and he seems too small to be a middle linebacker in this defense. Tom, is there any chance this is where he ends up when the regular season opens?
I don't think that size really matters when it comes to Mike Zimmer and his defense. He's found ways to get away with a lot of different kinds of parts through the years. You look at who he was working with on the back end with the top 5 defense in Cincinnati last year. He's got Pac-Man Jones starting back there. He's had Terrence Newman in the lineup. He's taken a guy like James Harrison and just found a spot that guy is going to be able to play. The Bengals had all sorts of issues. They lose one of the best defensive tackles in the game early last year, Geno Atkins, and they still end up ranking in the top 5 in defense for the 3rd consecutive year, 4th time in 5 years, something like that. Zimmer's a smart guy. I think that he understands defense, and he understands that your job as a coach is to fit your scheme to your players and not the other way around. I think that Greenway may fit best at middle linebacker, at least in part because they don't necessarily have a clear answer and a clear, obvious number 1 candidate to be there instead. But you also have to remember this, you're in sub-package defense half the time. Anthony Barr is going to move all over the place. We saw Barr get some first-team reps, his first practice back after being taken away by the quarter system. In minicamp, first practice back, Barr's taking first-team nickel reps alongside Greenway. And then when they go to the base, Barr's off the field, and you've got a different set of linebackers out there. I could see them absolutely building packages around these guys. Barr is the long-term strong-side linebacker, they think, but if his skill sets end up showing that he's just simply better as a pass rusher, that's what they'll ask him to do. One of the things they like, though, one of the things I think is underrated about Barr at this point is the fact that he can run in coverage. For a guy his size, he can really move, and he's so tall and so long that it's tough to throw the football over his head if he does get caught in a chasing vertical coverage sort of a situation. With Chad Greenway, now, this is probably Chad's last year with the Vikings in all likelihood. Maybe he ends up moving to the mic, maybe he doesn't. And maybe he ends up playing so well that he plays his way into a new deal. I don't think that Mike Zimmer would be shy about continuing to stick with a guy who's 31, 32, 33 years old as one of his starting linebackers. But anytime that you take a pay cut like Greenway did this year, you have to look at it as a one-year deal. And I think that Chad knows what's out there in front of him, and I think that if he's able to stay healthy, you remember he played over half last year, I think, with a broken wrist. And if he stays healthy, I think you're going to see the best that Greenway's got to offer.
You mentioned seeing Anthony Barr briefly in practice. Of course, the fans haven't seen him yet, really. Did he look comfortable going from a down defensive lineman in college to a linebacker thus far? And what are your thoughts about, we hear that Mike Zimmer is still putting some of the defensive linemen back in coverage, like a Brian Robinson drops in coverage, and Barr will go ahead and rush the passer. It didn't work so well with Frazier. Will it work for Mike Zimmer?
Well, the scheme's completely different. I think that's the big difference here. You know, with Frazier, it was, the Tampa 2 shell. They were playing a lot of zone. They had some zone blitzes. It wasn't a ton. You'd occasionally have man blitzes. I mean, I remember Jared Allen making an interception in man coverage like 15 yards down the field a couple of years ago. They did run some of those man blitzes and have your defensive ends dropping off and chasing people. I think that any defensive end in the league, any scheme that you play, they're going to end up in coverage some. That's just the way it is, because you need to throw different looks. You need to show different coverages out of different personnel and out of different formations. That's how you keep an offense off balance, and that's how you keep from being predictable. But at the same time, again, I don't think that Zimmer is going to be inclined to make these guys or ask them to do anything that they're not built to do. I think that Zimmer's a really smart coach. I think that with Anthony Barr, it's going to be a matter of, okay, what can the guy do? What makes sense for him? Is he going to be always in a stand-up position? Should we put him down in a three-point stance on certain occasions? I think that you're going to see them rush from a lot of different angles, but I also think that the hallmark of Zimmer's defense is they play the run first. When you see those guys come up out of their stances, they're not doing what you did in the Tampa 2, which is trying to shoot gaps, trying to get upfield, trying to be disruptive. What you're trying to do is you step in and you're going to walk onto that block and you're going to try to make plays off the block, but you're going to do it in a really balanced way. You're not just going to take chances and run up the field. I think you're going to see a substantial difference when you watch the line play, even in the preseason. If they're playing that defense right, you're not going to see the three technique firing into the backfield and trying to make a tackle. You're going to see those guys staying on the line of scrimmage, waiting for the play to develop, and then looking to make the play.
When you talk about the line, obviously Everson Griffin signed a big deal. Based on what you've seen from him, do you think he can really hold up as a run stopper and an every down defensive end?
That's the big question. Everson's played a ton of snaps. I mean, I want to say he's upwards of 600 snaps in the past couple of years because he plays so much as a rotational player. Some end, but a lot of interior nickel situations, rushing from the defensive tackle position. With Everson, it's just all about consistency. I mean, the guy's so physically talented. He does have such a quick first step. He's developed more pass rush moves. I think that he's become a better overall player through the years. When you drop that guy in coverage, I mean, everybody remembers that play against St. Louis where he had the pick six when he stepped in and Robinson got hurt. I mean, that's the guy you've got. I mean, he can run, he can move, he can beat you with a spin move, he can beat you with a swim move. He can do a lot of different things for you, but can he hold up against the run? I mean, that became a weakness for Jared Allen. Frankly, over the past couple of years, as you started to see him show a little bit of sign of decline. Now, part of that may be the way you play, and the fact that you were telling Jared you can turn it loose and get upfield, even if you get out of position for the run. Your job is to sack the quarterback. With Griffin, it's going to be different because that's not the way the Zimmer scheme operates. He's going to have to learn to play the run if he wants to be on the field to get those opportunities to rush the passer. But at the same time, let's not forget, for as big as that contract was, there's not a lot of fully guaranteed money. There's a lot of rolling guarantees, which is the way that the NFL is going now, protecting teams. They're not locked in for a ton of money. Griffin will be on the team for at least the next 2 years. Beyond that, his performance is going to dictate exactly what he ends up being for this team.
As we turn to the NFL as a whole, there's a rule change happening, at least for the preseason, where the NFL trials kicking extra points from 35 yards away. What are your thoughts on this potential rule change for the future?
I'm sort of torn on it. I'm not a football purist in the sense that I think that things shouldn't change. I think any time in any industry, if something makes more sense and it's better for your marketability and it's going to be better for the game or better for your business, I think you do it. But what strikes me as odd is you're creating a relatively difficult sort of a try for 1 point. I mean, you're really changing how that operates. I know the percentages are really high in terms of the rate at which NFL kickers convert 33 or 38-yard field goals. And, that's something that I think they're going to look at through the preseason and figure out, is this going to make a lot of sense? Is it going to be or is it going to incentivize teams to go for 2 more often? I think as much as anything, that might be what the NFL is hoping. I mean, really, you're going for a 2-point conversion, you're flipping a coin. It's a 50-50 shot that you're going to be able to convert that. Well, you're going to convert still the 38-yard field goal at a much higher percentage than that, but it's not 99.9 or whatever it's been in past years. It's going to drop a little bit from there. And so there may be certain teams that Chip Kelly's Eagles would be one that I would think would instantly do it. Might start going for 2 points every single time, unless there's a specific situation where they decide the 1 point makes a lot more sense. I think that they might come out and attempt to do that. As you have more college coaches coming up, I think you're going to see more teams going for 2. I think that as much as anything, another play from scrimmage is more exciting than a kicking play. I think that it's going to make the kicker's job and the long snapper's job a little bit more important, just by virtue of the fact that you could snap a one-hopper back there at an extra point. You still might be able to knuckle that thing through. It's not going to happen if you're kicking a 38-yard field goal. It's going to be a change for sure, but how big of a change, I think that remains to be seen.
It ought to be fun for fans whenever your team just scored the touchdown, they need the extra point to tie it up, and you realize that the opposing team's going to start calling all their timeouts for an extra point.
Yeah, it'll change strategy like anything else. I think you also have more teams investing in analytics and running those numbers. I mean, it's not an accident that a guy like Ron Rivera starts going for it on 4th downs last year, because he had somebody within the organization crunching the numbers and telling him you got the best 4th down quarterback in the NFL. You're not being as aggressive as you should be. Rivera starts rolling the dice a little bit, and that was fairly important. The Riverboat Ron thing, I think, gets a little bit overblown. But he did. I mean, he was statistically one of the most aggressive coaches in the NFL. And part of that is because you have people who are really breaking down the numbers and realizing, going for 4th downs more often is just simply a smarter percentage play. And I think you're going to see some of the same sort of analysis really going into the numbers now on 2-point conversions.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, one of the former players that fans ask about all the time, but we seemingly never hear from, is Antoine Winfield. Tom, do you know how strained his relationship is with the Vikings these days?
That's a good question, and I really don't know. I know that Antoine is back home. He's got a wife, he's got kids, and he's got other things that his life revolves around right now. I've tried to call him in the past, but all the phone numbers I have for him are disconnected, and that's not uncommon. I mean, NFL players change their phone numbers all the time. But he's sort of dropped off the grid a little bit. I know this. The Seahawks wanted him back. When you got into, I want to say it was December last year, and they had one of their corners suspended, then Browner got suspended. They were a little bit nicked up back there. They wanted Winfield to come back. They absolutely offered him the opportunity to come back, and Antoine decided to stay retired. He played a long time in the NFL. He played whatever it was, 15 seasons or so. He had certainly a distinguished career, but he was not the same guy. He was not as durable as he once was. I think that the toll had sort of added up for him. And when I went to training camp last year, I left. I tweeted something from the plane, and I caught a bunch of hell from Seahawks fans about it. But I said, I don't know that Antoine Winfield is going to make this team, because they did have so many young, talented players. And when you watch, guys like a Walter Thurman zooming around the field, you watch the way some of these younger guys move. Jeremy Lane, another one who was outstanding from a couple of practices I saw. You compare them to Antoine. It's not that Antoine, for what he did, wasn't still a functional player as far as being a slot guy, really strong in run support. But, I mean, it's night and day when you look at some of these younger players now, and I think that Antoine looked around and saw the same thing.
Yeah. Well, you've seen all the teams up and close and personal in the NFC North, and as we close out our conversation today, Tom, I wonder who you would expect to be the surprise team, good or bad, in the North, and how do you see this division shaking out in 2014?
I think the division is going to be much improved, and that's within the context of the quarterbacks not going through all the injury issues they did last year. I think the Packers, at this point, would be one of the dark horse Super Bowl teams, potentially out of the NFC. I think that they've really addressed some of their issues. Now, are you going to get something out of Julius Peppers? We'll see. I think that they believe it. They broke everything down, obviously, and thought that it was worth offering him $8 million a year. And Dom Capers, in theory, is going to move him all over the formation and rush him from a lot of different spots. That might take some heat off of Clay Matthews, who also, if you remember, was out for a lot of last season, broke his thumb a couple of times. That was a huge loss for them. They've used their top draft pick on Clinton Dix. They add some pieces offensively, too. Aaron Rodgers, when he comes back, is still one of the 5 best quarterbacks in the NFL. I think that he's just in terms of the way that he manages the game, the impact he can make on defenses, the way he can extend plays with his feet, get in and out of the pocket, make throws on the run. He's the complete package as a quarterback. And you also have Eddie Lacy, who redefined what the running back position was for the Packers last year. They actually had somebody who they were willing to be a lot more balanced with. I think the Packers are a really good team. I think the Chicago Bears are going to be a really good team, too, because if you look at how many games they won last year, despite Cutler's absence, and despite the fact that they had one of the worst defenses that the Bears have ever had in their illustrious history. I mean, that was an embarrassment. And it was partly because they had a bunch of injuries. I mean, they had, from the moment they lose Henry Melton in the early stages of the season, they weren't healthy. They were playing with backup caliber players along the defensive line. Their linebackers were nicked up. Briggs missed a bunch of time. Charles Tillman missed a bunch of time. They weren't able to stay healthy. They've added a lot of different parts. They signed Lamar Houston. They do bring in Jared Allen, who I think has something left at this point. He's certainly not finished. He takes care of his body. He's not the player he was, but he's probably better than what they had. They add some people on the back end too. They're going to revamp the safety position. They use one of their top pick on a cornerback as well. I think if that defense can even improve to mediocre, the offense has the opportunity to be so good. I think that they're probably a wild card team. And then the Lions and the Vikings are kind of hitting the reset button here. I think that both teams have talent, certainly, at least on the offensive side of the ball. But are they going to take the strides quickly enough? I think that they'd be hard-pressed in what looks to be a pretty difficult NFC.
Well, Tom, I can't tell you how glad your Twin Cities fans are to hear you come back and talk a little Vikings with us. And as a reminder to our listeners, you can get the most updated NFL news and notes from Tom's columns in USA Today at the newsstand or online at usatoday.com. And don't forget to follow Tom throughout the NFL season on Twitter at Tom Pelissero. Tom, again, thanks for taking the time to talk to VikeFans.com today.
You got it, Tom.